Okay, I'm sorry I wasn't at the conversation earlier because Angela has written a very interesting book which raises lots of important issues. And I think it's quite interesting that that Angela is being framed in some way in this second discussion around the question of identity, when there's actually very little about identity in Angela's book. What Angela does do, which I think is really important, is draw attention to new social media and the way in which our political communication today is increasingly being framed around questions of identity, precisely because we're participating in media platforms like Facebook, where it's premised on the basis of our identity. It's premised on the basis of our profile and the way that we like and dislike other kinds of things, and drawing together different groups of people on the basis of those shared likes and so on. And I think we really need to focus on that phenomenon, the phenomenon of new social media, and the way that that provokes a certain kind of intense, pernicious personalization of politics, so that everything becomes rooted in the personality of the person, of the one who's speaking. Accumulation of identities in that kind of way. So I think, yes, at some level there is a kind of problem that we need to tackle, but we need to locate the problem where it is, not in identity politics as such, but in the phenomenon of new social media and what kind of communication that invites us into and encourages us to think about as we're thinking about our politics. I couldn't be here earlier because I was at a meeting in London, a meeting of psychoanalysts. I work as a psychoanalyst, and I suppose if you were to ask, where is this rampant identity politics that everyone is worried about supposed to be? I suppose you should see it in some way connected with therapeutic politics, with therapeutic discourse, with the clinic, with that kind of thing. And I suppose it's not surprising that some of the people who are so obsessed with identity politics are also against therapeutic discourse, against safe spaces, against the attention to feelings in political discourse. But actually, something has been happening in psychoanalysis over the last decades, which is really significant, which has been a shift away from shoring up identity, identity mechanisms, defense mechanisms, the ego, and so on and so forth, to a deconstruction of identity, to encouraging people to think about how they have become trapped in a certain kind of self, how they become trapped in a certain kind of body which is defined in a certain kind of way. And while there are mainstream kinds of psychoanalysis which are still focused on the nuclear family and traditional heterosexual gender relations between the father and the mother, and that's the basis of stable gender identity, and the corresponding pathologization of gay experience. Most psychoanalysis today is shifting towards a deconstruction of identity. It's that deconstructive spirit which is in tune with cultural processes. Yes, it's true, some people are fixated on identity, but there is a countervailing trend which is also very important in the kinds of psychologization that are happening in general culture, which is about relationships, which is about groups of people getting together. It's not about identity. In fact, there's a questioning of identity in much contemporary political practice. And if you think, for example, of protests that have been happening in the last week in Manchester, I was involved in protests against the 1917 Balfour Declaration, which laid the basis for the formation of the Israeli state and the dispossession of the Palestinians. And if you can think about that Balfour Declaration as being an opportunity for anti-Semites in 1917 in Britain to be very concerned with identity, with identifying Jews that they wanted to keep out of Britain and to encourage them to go to Palestine instead and eventually settle there in the state of Israel. There's nothing new, as Ella said. There's nothing particularly new about identity and identity politics. But the way that we intervene in that is strategic, tactical. It takes identity and configures it in temporary ways in order to build alliances. In the demonstrations outside the Hilton Hotel on Tuesday, for example, we were shouting things like, in our thousands, in our millions, we are all Palestinians. Now, of course, it was patently untrue. Many of the participants were not Palestinians. Some of them were Jewish activists, active, supporting the Palestinians and chanting that as an identity statement in order to mobilize people for that moment, for that particular issue. So I think we need to put the focus exactly where it should be, on social media and the personalization, the psychologization of politics in that sphere, and the way that that feeds over and frames other kinds of politics. We need to acknowledge that there is a de-emphasis on identity in much cultural practice, not an obsession with identity at all. And we need to recognize that strategic essentialism, which underpins a lot of the activity of the left and the feminist and anti-racist movements today, is an opportunity for configuring identities in a certain kind of way for practical purposes. It's not about fixation on identity as such at all.